All right, I think we are live now. Hi everyone, all of you that are joining now to our I think this is our third Facebook Cafecito with Latinx Said. I'm really excited for our guest today who has amazing knowledge to share with us. And so just to get us started, I think we're going to have people coming in as we live. Any insightful things you hear or any connections you make to either who we are or what we have to say about the topic at hand. So I'll be starting and then our guests will be introducing themselves. My name is Jose Cisneros. As some of you have probably attended previous Facebook Live events, I am the Somos Carolina program manager at Atlantic Said. And so we want to give you a little more information if this is your first time attending one of our Facebook Live events. I work at Latinx Said, where Somos Carolina is one of our programs. Latinx Said is a nonprofit organization dedicated to investing in Latinx students, educators, and families in order to expand educational equity here in North Carolina. Our Somos Carolina program is currently, excuse me, based in Lee County and Orange County here near Chapel Hill, where we're based out of. And so our program is a 5-year program. It spans from middle school to high school. And we really work with our students to foster the self-efficacy, critical reflection, and support network for them to flourish as learners and leaders in our communities. So that's a little bit about our organization, who we are. Like I said, my name is Jose Cisneros. I grew up in North Carolina. I attended public schools all my life, went to UNC as well. And so my journey began in Mexico, but it really evolved and my entire life here in North Carolina. So after college, I was very excited to be able to have another opportunity to pursue education through the University of Notre Dame's Alliance for Catholic Education program, which is where I actually met Daniel, our guest for today. And so I was a teacher in ACE for 2 years. I completed my master's, and then I stayed a third year as well at the school where I taught. If you're probably not familiar with ACE. The way that I describe it sometimes is if you're familiar with Teach for America, this is kind of like the Catholic version in a way of that. Um, and so that's where I met Daniel. And we're going to talk more about how we got to know each other, but I want to give him the chance to introduce themselves.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Jose. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. What's up, everybody? I'm DJ. Just a little background about myself. I was born in LA, but grew up in the Bay Area, between Sacramento and Oakland. For undergrad, I went to Gonzaga University, Go Zags, number one, 24-0 this year. Got to say it. And then after that, I went to did the ACE program at Notre Dame with Jose. Which was, I have, again, if someone wants to ask me about that outside of this, I have good and bad experiences. And then after that, I went on, after teaching 2 years in Santa Ana, one of my favorite cities in California at this point. I stayed around. So I still have been working at my old school for now 4 years. And now I'm in grad school at UC Irvine. I'm doing my PhD, and at the same time as that, I've been, or I could talk about some of that later. But right now doing my PhD at UC Irvine, and my research is primarily focused on essentially decolonial models or liberation models of education, in the way in which Black and Indigenous communities have taken upon themselves to educate their people. Inside of schools and outside of schools. But my primary focus is to look at the ways in which we've done it outside of colonial institutions, the way in which we've tried to liberate ourselves outside of these institutions that have caused us so much harm and violence. And where I've kind of rested in that research is working with a lot of Indigenous mothers and senoras who, if we look throughout history, have been the leaders of these types of movements, right? If we look at we can look at Harriet Tubman, you can look at Fannie Lou Hamer, you can look at the Zapatistas in Mexico, right? And so really look, and my research really focused on looking at the way in which senoras and that women within the communities have really taken upon themselves to educate and liberate our communities. That's a little bit about me. What I'm interested in, what I'm studying right now. But at the end of the day, like, my love and my purpose is to be working alongside the people and to be educating and working alongside the youth. Being in the classroom and being working with students is just like will always be what drives the work that I do.
Awesome, Daniel. I appreciate you sharing about your background and what you're doing now. And just to give everyone a little bit more context, Daniel and I met in graduate school, like we said, at Notre Dame. And when Elaine and I were thinking about the topics for the cafecitos for this season and possible guests, Elaine had already kind of drafted lists of topics, and then I saw this topic and I was like, I have the perfect candidate who can be our guest for this. And I just remembered whenever it was early in the beginning, I remember just being very appreciative of Daniel's confidence and being brave and speaking the truth and not being afraid, because I was afraid, and I'm still learning, right? Like, there's so many things that I am scared maybe sometimes to speak about because I don't know how people react, and that's just something that I'm on the journey, right? And I remember in grad school I had a really rough senior year in college. And so I kind of at a low point in my mental health, my confidence as a person, as a scholar, and going into some of these discussions that we were having at Notre Dame and hearing Daniel, and I was like, wow, like he's speaking the truth. He's being real and feeling so inspired and motivated by you. And we've talked about this before, like, as well. And so I'm just very grateful that our paths crossed at Notre Dame and that now you're here. And now I'm working with Latinx Ed, and I'm very excited for what you have to say. And I do remember also talking about our experiences as teachers and some of the struggles that you were facing, especially like at your school, and also some of the things that I was facing, and how similar our school situations were. But also, again, inspired by everything you strive to do with the way you were teaching students, what you were trying to teach them, and some of the successes you did have, and of course some of those struggles as well, which we can definitely bring into the conversation as we go. So thank you, Daniel, for being here. I'm very excited to discuss the topic for today, which is decolonization in education. We titled it as a classroom, but of course, as we go, right, I think our sense of what decolonization means in education goes beyond just the classroom, and that's what I'm excited also to gain some insight into based on your experiences, your research, and the work that you're doing in the community out in California. So is there anything else you want to say before we kind of dive into the conversation?
I mean, I guess I could elaborate a little more on like the homeschool cooperative I work with. You want me to jump into that before? So the Unidos Homeschool Cooperative, which I highly recommend folks check out, is essentially a workers co-op, right? Which in like a solidarity economy model, it's about putting the resources and everything that is basically making a workers owned, right, co-op, and making sure that the students and the learners and the families, right, are the ones who are actually owning and controlling and have autonomy in what's happening with their school and their education. And it's led by essentially a group of senoras and comadres who have taken it upon themselves to build this like beautiful education model for their kids, where outside of COVID, right, it typically would be there's a learning plan that each student gets, each family gets, and they also are allowed to. Then we meet twice a week as well as a full cooperative. Right now, only via Zoom, but usually in person with different clubs, different all this stuff. And each family essentially is like working on their own homeschool agreement that they have with their local district. And then like as a community and as a collective, we kind of work together to, trial and error to on certain learning objectives. But the biggest thing I think really, right, is that man, it's so beautiful. The way in which the students are empowered, and the way in which that we have 4, 5, and 6-year-olds, right, talking about mutual aid, talking about liberation, talking about what pronouns they prefer to use, and having people respect their pronouns and their names, and having people understand what consent is as like a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, right, talking to trans and non-binary like 13-year-olds who are like are confident and are able to share and talk about their identity right at the age of 12 and 13. I know for me, as someone who now identifies as non-binary, like that, I didn't have access to that language at that age. And so just being able to have these types of conversations with students and with kids and families, and it's controlled by the kids and the families. It's an experience I would never give up, and I hope that kind of all y'all kind of get to experience something like that eventually, or at least see that type of model in action because it's beautiful. Yeah, no, I'll stop there though.
Awesome. No, I'm so excited to learn because I have been following your work on social media, and I think at one point I did check out sort of the curriculum, and I showed it to Elaine. We were like, oh, this is so rich, it's so exciting. And like you said, the direct control over it by families and how they guide their own education is so inspiring, and it's like so needed at this time. And so finding ways to do that and replicate that model, I'm really excited just to learn more about that. But I do want to talk about the topic at hand, more like starting off in the historical perspective. Um, can you talk more a little bit about what was the historic purpose of education as a system in the United States, and maybe some of the traditional roles that educators have played in the system?
Yeah, so I think it's important when we look at education in whatever country we're talking about is understanding it as that, right, a system, and all systems have principles and all systems have goals, right? And so education in America, right, when it was started as a public institution, as a public system, it was built as a colonial mechanism, right? It was built to engage in colonization, right? To have control and power over the current occupants of the land, or the indigenous peoples of the land. And so when we think about our first boarding schools on America, right, they were they're on reservations, which is already regions that were hyper isolated from resources, areas that were hyper isolated from anywhere that they were already comfortable with, areas that were hyper isolated and forced multiple groups and tribes and nations onto one small area of land with very few resources, right? And these schools were built to control and to assimilate, right, the indigenous populations. And it was kill the Indian, save the man, right? That was literally the slogan of the person who invented and designed the first education models in America. So it's understanding that by design, whether we look at it today or look at it 10 years ago or look at it when on the first reservation, they were designed for that, right? For as a mechanism of colonization. And we can, if you look at Black communities, if you look at indigenous communities, if you look at brown and central Latin American communities, right? Like schools function in the same way, right? We're not allowed the agency and the autonomy and the freedom to enter into that space and claim it as our own, right? Because it was not built for us. And I think within that, it's important to name also capitalism, right? In the way in which that what is the purpose of education, right? Are we actually training, or not training? Are we educating, right? And educating kids and our citizens to become people who understand their identities, understand their history, understand their purpose in life, who understand their relationship to community, their relationship to each other, and what you know what I mean? Like what it means to seek justice and to have resources and all of these things. Or are we simply training people to learn a certain history, right? And are we training people simply to just get out of school and get into the workforce? Right. So what is the purpose of education? Do we want it to actually improve our everyday life? Or are we looking for it to benefit the economy, to benefit capitalism, right? And if we look at the student debt conversations, I think we know which one our education system serves right now, and it's capitalism. And so that's it. So when we talk about the history of education, I always start with colonization, settler colonialism, right? It's a lot different. Settler colonialism and capitalism, right? Because those are the two things that drive why our education system does what it does in a lot of different ways.
Well, yeah, and I think this is something that I started exploring when I was at UNC, but now I'm teaching a course on the educational experience of the Latinx community in the US. And my students who are present at the moment in the audience here can probably remember our readings we've had when the Mexican annexation occurred. There, like, you don't really learn about what happened in like your high school classes, right? About history. You just learn, oh, there was a war, and then the US got a piece of Mexico. And then there's like no acknowledgement of the people that lived there, of their experiences after they were annexed into the US. And something that we've been learning about is how it's been replicated with multiple groups throughout history of this type of settler colonialism, and how it impacts the people, the indigenous people living there, and how Mexicans were basically colonized in the Southwest through education, and subtractive schooling, where they wanted to take away their culture, they wanted to take their language, they took away their political institutions, they took away their land. And like, we can trace so many things back to that part of history that is not even acknowledged, it's not even studied, and it's not even recognized in our textbooks. And the way we're learning and engaging with history is very like settler perspective based.
Yeah, and if I could jump in,
Yeah.
like there's we always I talk a lot about symptoms, so like symptoms of settler colonialism, right? A lot of that is it is these gender hierarchies, right? It is the hierarchies that are created. So when we think about the if that's why for me it's understanding our history is such a big part of it, because if we look back at our history as colonized people, as Black and Indigenous and brown people, our ancestors were queer, our ancestors were trans, our ancestors didn't have these gender binaries, right? And all of these strict hierarchies within genders, right? If when the first colonizers stepped foot in Africa, like they created these slurs and these analyses um against queer identities and against trans identities to make sure that the people that they were colonizing abided by their rules, because they only understood gender as this one construct, right? And or if we look back in our history and we were actually taught it, we would understand that for 500 years since colonization happened in the Americas, North and South America, Black and Indigenous people have been resisting it from the jump, like from the jump, and their goal to resist it was to end it, was to make sure that settler colonialism was no more. And I think that we look now, like when we don't understand our history, what history are we taught, right? We're taught a history where Martin Luther King worked alongside America and met with the presidents, and he did everything the right way and peacefully, right? And if we look at all of it, Indigenous, Black, Brown, Latin American, Central American communities, we're not told, and we don't learn about our people who have resisted and have always resisted, and why they resisted and how they resisted. And I think that's what's so important about understanding our own history too, because we would have a stronger sense of ourselves, a stronger sense of identity, right? We wouldn't question why we don't feel comfortable within this gender binary. We wouldn't question why we feel uncomfortable within super white spaces that are super restrictive of who we are, right? We would understand that our people have never felt comfortable, and we're not supposed to feel comfortable in those spaces, and we're supposed to create our own for ourselves. And sorry, your point just made me think of that too. I just because it's
Oh
so
yeah.
it's so important to just talk about how this isn't a thing that like we're not just making this shit up, right? Like this happened before colonization, like for hundreds of years, our communities existed way differently, right? We didn't have gender binaries, we didn't have all these things that we have to confront now.
Yeah, and you just brought up such a good point of like growing up and you feel like something's wrong, you feel like something's not right, right? But you don't know how to explain it. You don't know like what it's connected to, and it's connected to all of this history that we don't have access to in our schools. We don't get
Elgin,
it's not
that's your
valued.
That's I always say that's your ancestor. I don't always say. I've heard other people say it too. It's your ancestors talking to you.
I know that's, and now it's like looking back, I'm like that was just so many things that I felt were wrong and I didn't know how to explain, and I didn't know how to go about it, and like trying to understand what was going on with those feelings. And like I feel like some of my peers expressed it, but they were seen, of course, like the troublemakers, like the kids that are rebellious, like they were expressing that frustration with the system and with the environment and with the people involved in it.
Because it's and the system itself is trained very well to stomp out any type of rebellious behavior, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's a group of rebellious people or the one rebellious student in the classroom, right? You can talk about it as whether it's the FBI setting it up or if it's the one teacher in the classroom, right? It's the same system that's trying to stop that rebellious kid or that rebellious thing.
Yeah, certainly. So I guess I wanted to talk a little bit more with that connection to history, thinking back, the traditional role of teachers and how they have enabled this type of education where, it's colonialism based.
Wait, can you reword that? Sorry.
I guess like explaining more like the role of educators within the system that enable this colonialism throughout.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, it's kind of a tough question. I think what happens is, right, you have the principles and the system itself, right, and then you have people within it, right, who are, you can call them, I don't know, however you want to identify, but a lot of times I use the word agent, who's like an agent of that system, who carries out the everyday practices that cause the violence of that, right, and whether teachers or educators are conscious of it or not, they're complicit in that violence, right, and that's what's important to understand. It's like, well, it's not about whether this person is a good or bad person. It's like if we go back to the good cop, bad cop argument, right? It's not about that. It's not about that at all. It's about that the system that they're engaged with, whether they're conscious of it or not. That's not the question. They enact violence, being within that system and being a perpetrator of the violence in that system. And we see educators do this all the time. I know my own experiences as a student who I was not diagnosed with ADHD until like this year. It was always just me, the misbehaving Black kid in class, in the predominantly white class, who was just annoying and always wanted to run his mouth. But I didn't, again, it was me having with being a student who was neurodivergent in that classroom and also Black in that classroom. You might see how that space was not built for me. In that space, because of the way I behaved in that space, I was able to be villainized a lot of times. And we see this all the time, right? We see this all the time. And it mostly impacts, if we think about it, right, it mostly impacts disabled, it mostly impacts trans, it mostly impacts women, it mostly impacts queer folks, right? Within these, so the most vulnerable people in these spaces are going to experience it. And that's what occurs, right? That's what occurs. And we see with the teachers, again, whether they're conscious of it or not, even aren't even able to practice certain things that can help the students out, right? So I know in my experiences, I was often villainized as a teacher for talking about pronouns. I was villainized as a teacher for talking about sexuality and gender being two different things, right? I was often villainized for being someone who talked about abolition in the classroom, right? And so even if you do have certain teachers trying to do the good thing, the system itself will make sure that that can't keep happening. And so it's like it's important that when we ask questions about these systems, that we also ask questions of how the violence and how the harm is enacted. And so a lot of times it's going to be it's the teachers, and if we're talking about education, it's a lot of times it's going to be the educators and the people within that who are carrying out the everyday violence and harm that occurs within the system.
Yeah, I remember also back to when I was a teacher, and again, like still not fully aware of everything that I was feeling, but I was like, something's like this is not working. Like I can see it's not working, but like you said, the system sort of like crushing you in a way to like be complicit in it. And it was extremely difficult to try to do things differently, to even like engage with the students differently, because then you're like, oh, he's just a cool teacher. But it's like, I'm not trying to be the cool I'm trying to be a good teacher of a teacher that is actually helping, empowering, inspiring, and helping my students like
Yeah.
learn about themselves and become who they should be becoming.
Yeah, and that's what's one like I mean, it's manipulative and abusive, right? One thing about the system is that it gets you to gaslight yourself. Like, you start to gaslight yourself because everybody within it starts to gaslight you, and then you're like, "Whoa, am I not supposed to be doing this?" Like, "Oh, like I like to. I'd rather have spend time in my lunch hour with my students rather than a bunch of teachers talking shit about my students. Should I not do that? Like, should I? But right, and you start to gaslight your own decisions because everybody within the system is telling you it's wrong. And
Oh my God, yes. Oh, and just like feeling like if I ate lunch with the other teachers, like feeling so shitty about myself and like what I was doing. And I was like,
they're
I would
talking.
rather go talk with my kids about life and answer the questions, random questions they might have. And
I
like,
want for the record, I want to say so people are listening, I don't know how many people, but for the record, if you are a grown adult human who talks ill and bad about a child or a teenager, you're a weirdo. You're a weirdo. Don't do it. Don't do it. You should be wanting to mentor and educate them. Do not be a weirdo who talks crap about teenagers and kids.
amen, amen.
Don't be a weirdo. Don't be a 60-year-old teacher who gets upset about a
Exactly. I'm
12-year-old.
like, what kind of environment are you creating if you're saying all these things behind their back? Like, what are you saying in front of them?
Exactly.
And obviously, like, I think it came to a point where my kids started feeling more comfortable with me and they started selling, not directly naming other teachers, but like feeling just uncomfortable with certain things. And like, they're like, oh, like this school is like just always putting me down. And I'm like, "Ah, I feel you, man. Like, just, and it's like, I was at the point where I just didn't know what to do anymore. I was like, and now I was like, I just need to leave and do something different. And I feel like,
And
I'm definitely where I need to be now.
yeah, it's tough. I just think it's important, right? You gotta name these experiences, right, as violent, and understanding that like most schools, like there are kids inside that school that feel like that, right? And then that's what we have to like reckon with and deal with, right, as a society.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, this sort of transitions into the next part of our conversation. And a question that I had is, how do power, control, and discipline manifest in the U.S. classrooms and in schools today?
Yeah. So one important, I think, when we talk about power, is important. We got to talk about hierarchies, and talk about this idea of like lateral violence, so like top down violence. And if we look at systems of capitalism, right, they're all built to have hierarchies and to have top down violence. And the reason that is because inside of and if I'm over explaining for people who already understand this, I apologize. But like the system of capitalism is designed to bring any surplus that is created, so anything that is an excess resource is controlled and brought back to the ruling class, right? And you can think about this in a small scale, as in a classroom, right? Because it's set up as a hierarchy, anything that is created or done by the students is owned, operated, and controlled by the teacher in that classroom, right? So anything the good that comes out of what the students do, the teacher has full control and basically voice over anything that happens to it, right? And that's what happens. So like that's how surplus is taken from the people and put into the power of a single person, and those are the type of dynamics that we want to talk about breaking down, right? But we don't. That's why in like the Unidos Homeschool Cooperative, right? There's not a principal, there's not a head teacher, there's not a lead family. No, everyone's just a member of it. And I think that's how we have to think about our classroom spaces. Our classroom spaces create these power dynamics inherently, and they won't go away by just talking about it. They won't go away by us just saying that we have a decolonized classroom, because guess what, you're still a teacher, you still have a boss, your boss still has a boss, and your boss's boss still has a boss, all these things. All right, so like let's not metaphorically decolonize the classroom. Let's talk about what a decolonized classroom should look like, or what decolonized school should look like. And taking down those power structures means not having a teacher that has more power over the student sitting in the class next to them. It means actually breaking down these power structures in your personal lives, right, in your relationships, in the one small classroom that you have, in just your school environment, right, whatever scale you want to grow it out. It's about understanding how capitalism forces us to create these hierarchies in our relationships, and have these really, what word am I looking at? Transactional relationships with people, where it's not reciprocal, it's not mutual aid, it's not, well, Jose and I are friends because, and we reciprocate love and attention and care and information and all these things. Or am I really just like manipulating and getting him to do a bunch of things for me, and I feel good about myself, but it's like draining his energy, right? And so it's like that's not a balanced relationship. And so when we talk about power, it's at every level. Are we talking about a big institution? You're talking about it in your own heart when you look in the mirror, talking about it with your partner. Like power is everywhere. And it's understanding that we have to break down the dynamics and the hierarchies within those relationships that create power. And let's not just like metaphorically talk about it, right? Like, so if we want to decolonize our classroom, it's acknowledging the fact that it can't actually happen because you have a boss, but then also having the conversation that like, but look, this is how we're going to practice it. This is how we're going to practice it in this space to make it as if there is no power structure. And so that's kind of the challenge.
Now, in terms of like discipline, like what have you either like studied or witnessed how it especially affects students of color in our educational system now?
Yeah. And so so when we talk about like power and who gets harmed the most, um, realistically, right, every student can experience harm, right? And if when we address harm, it should benefit every student. So if we address the issue of white supremacy, it should also benefit white folks. Like, it's not saying that they were the focus of why we tore down white supremacy, but white supremacy also creates like really shitty environments for white communities as well, right? We know it's super violent, it causes a lot of abuse, all these different things. And so when we in the classroom, or when we're talking about breaking down power dynamics, it's gonna affect students of color the most. It's gonna, and we talk about, so say it affects Black students the most, it's gonna affect Black women and Black trans folks and Black queer folks even more, Black poor folks even more. And so when we have these issues, it's understanding that the issue is real, and it exists on a spectrum. So people experience it in different ways, and people experience the violence in different ways. People experience the harm in different ways. And if we look at it like statistically, it's I mean, we can do a number of things, right? You can look at the school to prison pipeline, right? We can look at the fact that immigrant kids and incarcerated youth in cities, right, are forced to go to school inside of detention centers and inside of prisons, or aren't even provided access to education, right? And which kids are make up most of the incarcerated or the immigrant population, right? It's Black and brown kids, right? It's not, right. And so we talk about who experiences the violence. It's always going to be the most underdeveloped, the most colonized, the most oppressed communities within that. And so that's why whenever I talk about these types of things, it's addressing that, like, okay, yeah, Black and Indigenous communities experience violence and colonization the worst. And within those communities, it's going to be trans women and queer women and disabled folks, right, who experience that violence even more within their community.
Yeah, I think you made me think about also like how the criminalization of certain groups even starts within schools. The way that certain teachers interact with them, it's very much like, and I witnessed this too, and I was like, well, like what is it that we're trying to do here when we're treating our young men as like potential criminals when they're just being children? And like what kind of mentality do you have and like are inculcating in these students where they don't feel comfortable even in this space where it should be a safe space? It should be a space where they can learn, make mistakes, and learn from those mistakes and grow and be able to talk honestly about what's going on. Because a lot of the times what was going on is like, I feel like some of my boys just felt really frustrated because they had a lot of emotions and they didn't know how to process them, because I don't know, maybe the way they were not allowed to even process their emotions. It's like having a space where you can process emotions, not just for boys, like or any all our students, right? Boys, girls, and other students that are in our classrooms, that they can feel comfortable processing what is going on inside, because we don't even allow room for that in our classrooms. It's just about, you got to learn this, you got to learn this, you got to take this test, you can't pass it, okay, you got to study more so you can pass this test. And like where do we even acknowledge, right? Like the full being, like you are a person and you're learning and your emotions are part of that learning and part of your development.
Yeah.
Just made me think about that because so many of them were so frustrated and they had so
Yeah.
much anger because they didn't know how to process their
No,
emotions. And I was like,
yeah.
oh,
Yeah, that's super real, and that makes me want to talk about a little bit about just kind of like right this idea that as people who've experienced trauma and people who've experienced generational trauma, right, and again talking about Black and Indigenous communities and most and vulnerable folks within that, um, when you've experienced so much violence and harm in your life, I promise you, you have the capacity to also cause violence and harm on other people. And a lot of times, the violence and harm that you cause is because of the trauma and the generational trauma that you or your people experienced. Right? That's reality. Right? It's not like a question of if and or but. Like that. That is the reality. Harm occurs because of the years of trauma and violence that has occurred in certain communities, right? And so when we talk about abolition, that's the key thing of it, right? It's acknowledging that okay, these people have committed or have caused harm or have caused violence, but it's not because they're inherently a horrible person. It's not because inherently they are violent and want to cause harm to people, but it could be things that they experience in their life, right? So a very simple example I think is always like someone steals to get food, right? Okay, why they do that? They were hungry. It's very simple. And so it's understanding that there were conditions created within that environment to cause them to cause harm. And I think that's what we have to talk about at schools too. There's conditions created within our communities, within our families, within our schools that where people are experiencing so much trauma, experiencing so much violence in different parts of their life that they act out or they cause harm in other ways, or they weren't taught how to process their emotions. They weren't taught how to hold themselves accountable for mistakes that they made. They weren't taught how to have difficult conversations and or they weren't taught how to respect people's autonomy and agency. They weren't taught what consent was. But the list can go on forever, and it's acknowledging that and understanding that we have to address also the conditions that created that to occur, like because it's not just the individual causing harm. There were conditions in that classroom, in that school, in that society that permitted and caused those people and allowed for those people to cause harm. um, and then the important question is how do we respond to that, right? So it's, are we going to respond to that with punishment and solitary confinement in prison, or are we gonna respond to that with accountability and collective care and a community centered process that helps that person grow and address not just what that person did, but the conditions in the society that or in that school that caused the person to do what they did. Sorry, that was long winded, but like that's what you made me. That's
that
what you
was
made
super
me think of.
powerful. Yeah, like just the realization that like harmed individuals or harmed people can cause harm as well, like because of the initial harm. It's just an idea that I think even as individuals, like of people of color, when you come to that realization, like there's so much learning that you can do for your own good that can help you in your families, can help you in your workplace, like just on an individual basis, but also like imagine what we can do, right? If we're able to do this on a larger scale with everyone, because there's so much trauma, like you said, that needs to be addressed, and it's not being addressed in our schools. So it's like we need to find and create ways to address it ourselves in our communities. And I'm really excited that in Unidos, like right, like it seems like this is what you're aiming to do. I don't know if do you want to talk more about that? How that is part of the Unidos homeschool cooperative?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way I would put it is that like it's the addressing like the conditions of our society is built into everything that we do, right? So we do a lot of meditative work. We do a lot of physical and yoga activities. We do um, a lot of like gauging emotions and working through emotions, right? Thinking about difficult times that we've had, thinking about joyful moments, right? And being able to process these things is super important. Being able to acknowledge that you've experienced harm is that's hard. Being able to acknowledge that you've caused harm, being able to acknowledge when you feel super uncomfortable and ask why I feel uncomfortable, right? And being able to work through those things, because a lot of times when we cause harm, it's because we were unable to do that. We were unable to process what we were feeling. We were unable to address why we felt uncomfortable. We were unable to address X, Y, and Z, and so we did Y. Unable to address X, so we did Y. And so that's one of the things that's just like integrated into everything that we do, right? Every single day we check in. Like, how are we doing? Like, was there something this week that brought you joy? Was there something you've been struggling with? Like, let's talk about it. And then like it'll be quiet for 5 minutes, and then one of the 8-year-olds will speak up, and then like every student will go and talk about something they struggled with and something that brought them joy, right? And like, and this is, I'm telling you, this is 4-year-olds to 13-year-olds all in the same group talking about things that they struggled with, and kids chiming in to give advice and like, oh, I experienced something like that one time, here's something, right? And it's like, so even if it's talking about something that you did wrong, that you caused harm, it's being able to hold yourself accountable, talk about that to the group, and then the group is like talking you through that. And imagine doing that from the age of 4 moving forward. So when you get to the whatever age you're at, it's not weird to do that. It's not weird. But when you're 25 and you've never engaged that thing, and you are in an uncomfortable situation and you respond with a violent outburst, right? Are we going to blame that single person who was never taught how to deal with that situation? Or are we going to address the conditions in their life that didn't prepare them how to address with those situations in there, right? And so it's less about like doing it one time when a situation occurs, right? But it's about it being a process, and always being prepared to address harm and violence, and always being prepared to help people process those types of things in a community environment.
That's so beautiful. I think we do something similar with our Somos scholars. It's called El Círculo, and they share carga and a regalo. So something that gives them joy, something it's just, and that in our feedback, that's like something they always highlight, how they feel comfortable and they want that space where they can talk about, things that are good in their life, but also things they're struggling with, because you're acknowledging, right? Like, you're a human being. You're not going to be perfect, happy, successful all the time, right? Like, it's just part of human nature. And like, how do we address that and also process it, because it's not being processed, it's not being addressed in our schools, in the public school system especially. So I guess moving more into like this call to action to decolonize the classroom, what does that mean to you, and what does that look like, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I talked about it a little bit. I think it's important, first, right, that is like decolonization is not like, it's not this grand metaphor that we should use for everything. And it's also not good enough to just simply start off with like a land acknowledgement, for example, right? So if you're going to start off with a land acknowledgement, you should follow that land acknowledgement with the fact that the people that you just named still don't have sovereignty or agency over the land that we occupy, that we benefit from, and that the point of this land acknowledgement is to understand that we're striving towards those nations and tribes having full sovereignty and control over their land that we currently occupy, right? And so that's kind of the difference in the framing, because in the academy and in academics, in most situations, we love to pat ourselves on the back and just be like, hi, my name is DJ, I occupy Tongva land, and now I'm going to talk about my topic. Like, you're using it as a metaphor. You're trying to just act like you care about it, right? And so I think it's important that when we talk about decolonization, we actually talk about it, and we actually talk about what steps we need to take to get there, step by step. So if you know it by definition, that's cool. But like, what are we gonna do tomorrow? What are we gonna do the next 12 months of my life? What am I gonna do the next 5 years of my life to make sure that anything that I do, right? I could be a teacher, I could be a janitor, I can be a student, I can be any whatever. The purpose of your work should be to push towards decolonization, right? And under capitalism, right, we don't always have that time, or sometimes we're forced to work 60 hours a week just to survive. But it's understanding that you still have things that you can do in your time, right, to either educate some people, or at least educate yourself, or position yourself so that you're working towards not having to be to work 60 hours a week, and you can fit and do more work alongside other people who are working towards decolonization. Sorry, this is one of my favorite topics, so I'm probably just rambling at this point. But for me, it's super important that we talk about actionable steps towards decolonization. And then, what does decolonization mean? So for me, decolonization means the removal of the settler state, which in this sense would be America, right? The settler state would be America. Or if we're talking about Palestine, the removal of the settler state of Israel, right, which operates and settles and occupies and causes violence on the indigenous communities to the land. So it's the removal of that state and the return of sovereignty, autonomy, and agency over the land back to the people it originally had. Um, and a lot of people want to be like, oh no, and we a lot of times we project our own ideals onto other people. So it's like, oh my God, if that happens, then the indigenous people are just going to commit genocide and kill all of us and kill all the white people. They're just going to take their land back, right? That's always a lot of people's first response. It's like, oh my God, if we do that, I have no control over anything. Well, again, like that's not the question. We can't project our violent ideals onto other people and assume that that's how they're going to how communities are going to react. It's understanding that that is a human right. That is a human right. It's not about civil rights. It's about the sovereignty or the right that nations and indigenous peoples have to the land that they've occupied for thousands of years. And so when we talk about decolonization, that's what we mean. Like, it means those original occupants of the land having complete autonomy and complete agency over it. And then talking about actionable steps to get there is a different conversation. But it takes a lot of educating ourselves on what liberation movements have done in the past to liberate themselves and decolonize their land. And we, again, the Zapatistas are a great example. The Rojava Autonomous Region is a great example. If we look at movements that were started, like the Black Panthers and the Black Liberation Army, if we look at a lot of the Pan-African movements in Africa during the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, we look at, you can look at Ghana, you can look at Burkina Faso, you can look at, right, all different examples, right? But seeing how did they go about removing the colonizer from their society and situating themselves to take care of themselves and their people. Sorry, it's long-winded, but it's just like it's addressing what colonization is, what does it mean to decolonize, and then how do we get there?
Wow, that's super insightful. And again, like you're always like a person that I feel challenged to think more critically about what is it that I'm doing and like what is it that I believe and like why. So I'm excited to just keep exploring and learning from you and growing in this. Now, like we have a lot of educators and teachers in our audience probably. What resources do you think or like what are first steps, I guess, to begin that journey for learning in this movement?
Yeah. So I think the first step always is I mean, for me, it's like seeing that practice in action. But also I think just like reading and learning yourself. So I think a good place to start always is, and I can, if you want to like put my email somewhere for folks, I'm more than happy to respond to people and give resources. But decolonization is not a metaphor is a great start. It's a short article. And it gives basically a lot of the background and info and the stuff that I was talking about. And then I would honestly like watch documentaries about like the Zapatistas and about like Cooperation Jackson and about Rojava. Like go on the School of the Zapatistas website and see how they have built their entire education system as an indigenous run community, indigenous run autonomous community within the state of Chiapas. Like go see how they do it, see what they do, see the types of education material they put out, look at the purpose of the education and the goals, right? It's not to make sure that every student it was going to be have a perfect resume and be able to get that unpaid internship when they finish college. It's about teaching people how to like care about their neighbors, teaching people that justice means all of us having resources and how to build communities that have resources, right? How do we build communities where all of us have access to water? How do we build communities where all of us have access to food? Right? You can still be an engineer, you can still be a doctor, you can still be an architect, whatever, but are you going to do that so that the community has access to that for an agency to that, whatever, right? And that's kind of the key. I think it'd be easier if folks have like specific readings and stuff that they want to get to. I can either compile a list for multiple people or people can hit me up directly. But I definitely think starting with like those documentaries and like really looking into what do societies and communities without power, without hierarchies look like? And I think that's a good place to start, because for me that was always, how can I do that in my classroom? How do I create a classroom or a learning environment where we genuinely are, we do all have the same autonomy and agency, where any decision that is made is a collective decision. Every choice that is made is a collective choice. Everything is done in a collective manner. And I think that's super important, because we're taught that we should be individuals. We should all want to go move into the small picket or the big house with the picket fence on our own property with just me and my family, right? Like we never lived that way, ever. Like our communities lived as communities. The whole community raised the child. The whole community was involved in feeding the people. The whole, like, that's how Black and Indigenous communities lived. And so, like, let's look at how we can recreate those types of relationships.
Yeah, that last part I think reminded me. So I'm part of this kind of sort of related, but it is connected. To It's a self-care group, collective care, and it's Black and Indigenous people of color. And that was something that someone brought up. They that said our communities used to, it was collective care was part of our societies, like taking care of each other through different means was part of who we were, and that was robbed from us. And why was that robbed, right? Like, why was that taken from us?
Because it works.
Exactly. Like, if you're the easiest way to like target communities, if you create this sense of individualism that only like the strongest survive, then like the one or two will survive and go thrive, and then the rest are left with nothing basically. And so that just made me think of that, how it connected to that.
No, that's exactly it, right? That it's intentionally isolating. When we think about capitalism, like it's intentionally isolating, right? Because when you look at what was the only way, right now we can look at it in real time. What happened in Texas not too long ago, right? There was a massive, um, basically, right, the weather advisory, weather emergency, and the government chose not to respond. They could have addressed the issues and they chose not to. And who had to step up and make sure that everything happened? It was the community. Who kept people fed? It was the community. Who got people water? It was the community, right? And that is how we survive. That's the only way we're gonna survive, because the system itself will let us die. Like that's what we have to like know. Like they want us to be isolated so then they can like let people literally die. But I think people thinks it sounds extreme, it sounds radical, whatever. But like this is what happened a couple weeks ago. A mayor of a city tweeted out their feelings about what happened and said nobody deserves handouts during a weather emergency where people are like freezing inside their own homes, right? Like it's built that way, and that wasn't an accident. And we have to ask questions why. And so
Yeah.
if you're not involved in some type of collective or mutual aid thing that people will support you when things go down, like you got to have community around you.
Yeah, and I did see the different groups, mutual aid groups in Dallas. Like, for example, I have a connection to Dallas because I lived there for 3 years. Like, those were the types of groups like feeding people and taking care of people in the middle of the winter crisis, because the government wasn't basically doing anything to help the people, which, I mean, that just shows you, right, the harm that's
Yeah.
being done. I guess we do have time for questions. So if there are any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments here on Facebook. We'll be sharing Daniel's email as well if he's comfortable with that, so that
Yeah.
if anyone has any questions or maybe they want to access some of the readings you mentioned, that they do have access to that. But again, like I came into this and I started thinking about like, I don't think this is just going to focus on the classroom because it's so much bigger than that, right? Like all of these systems are connected. And so I was ready to hear what you had to say, because I know like it's the classroom is just one part of it, right? It's all connected, and we can do so much more than just decolonizing our classroom.
Mhm.
All right. I don't know if there are any questions so far. All right. So there's a link to the Zapatista principles that Daniel actually shared with us as we were preparing for this cafecito. So definitely check those out. I think there's a few videos as well that he recommended. We can post some of those links in the comments later as well. So we appreciate everyone. I don't know if we're getting any questions so far. I'm seeing some of the comments, and thankfully, or I hope that what we had to say and what Daniel had to say resonated with you, and it made you think differently and more critically about what it is that you can do in our society to, especially in education, right? All right. Well, Daniel, it was so good to see you.
Of course.
Appreciate everything you have to offer and everything you're teaching me, and I hope you're teach that others are learning from you as well, because it's so much needed, especially now after so many recent events, where people are like somehow aware that there's racism or they're somehow aware that there's inequality. Like, what can we do, right? So I appreciate you, and it was so good talking to you, and I'm excited to continue learning from you.
And I want to I appreciate first of all appreciate you, always love and gratitude to you always, just for you being in my life and inviting me here. And I want to say to everybody that's if anybody's listening, if there's even one person, like go don't like let this be like, oh, I learned a lot and that was cool. Like today, go find a mutual aid organization in your community, or go find a some type of on the ground education initiative, or that is working autonomous to an institution. Like, go find them and go do work with them. I know I can, like, I know what Jose's talking about, Dallas Feed the People Dallas is a great one. I know I work with a mutual aid group called the People's Coalition. If you want to look at more, there's like neighbor programs, there's people's programs. I know there's stuff out in North Carolina because they've reached that we've been in contact with them as a mutual aid organization. So when you're done with this call, like, go find a mutual aid organization, go find a collective in your city that is doing abolitionist work, that's doing education work, that's doing decolonization work, and like either give them money or go do work with them. One of the two. That's my only call to action for everybody.
For sure, for sure. So good seeing you. I appreciate you, and I can't wait to be in touch again.
Grateful.
All
Peace.
right. Well, everyone, we'll be dropping some links to some of the things that were mentioned in the cafecito. Definitely check those out. And like Daniel was saying, this should not just be like the only thing you should think about when it comes to decolonization, and the way you can play a role in that. And so I hope that everyone is excited to keep learning and doing something. Like he said, it goes beyond the learning; it's the action part as well. And so thank you, Daniel.
Of
Hope
course.
everyone enjoyed it, and see y'all next time.
Peace, everyone.